So again, welcome. I'm Joanna Govman with Urban Environmentalists, and we are very excited to have Assembly candidate Bilal Mahmood join us for meet and greet and Q&A. Urban Environmentalists believes in addressing the climate and inequality crises by designing cities around people and not cars. And we're very happy to be co-hosting with our friends from Streets for People and SF YIMBY. So thanks to all of you who are joining from those groups. And thanks to Bilal Mahmood for coming to speak with everyone today. I'll let you introduce yourself because I think that will be more interesting than me doing it. But I'll just start off by saying that we do have a special assembly election coming up because Dennis Herrera, our city attorney, became the head, or is about to become, I'm not sure, of the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. And then our current assembly member for the eastern part of San Francisco, Assemblymember Chu, became or is becoming the new city attorney. I'm not quite sure exactly what state it is, but he is.
Soon,
he's been appointed already officially. And then that leaves an opening in our Assembly District 17. And therefore, we're going to have a special election and decide who should be representing us for the remainder of that term. We've had a few candidates who already declared their interests, and we're hoping to have all of them come and speak to you and be able to just have dialogue with you and answer your questions and share what they care about and what their thoughts are on housing and transportation and urban environmentalism. And we're really excited to start with you, Bilal. So I think I'll turn it over to you for a bit now. If you could just tell us a bit about yourself and why these issues of housing and transportation and urbanism and environmentalism are so important to you.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. And I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of how you framed it earlier, that it's the central themes of our campaign is inequality and climate. I'm running because I feel that those issues are the existential threats to our democracy, but also to the dream of the middle class and immigrants. And we have a ticking time bomb with climate. IPCC report says with 5 to 8 years left before we reach the point of no return, and we have to move from mitigation to adaptation. And I really feel we need bold policy to actually drive that forward, and that's why I'm running. And then running because it's a very personal story and decision for me as well. Facets of inequality and climate are what inhibits the American dream of upward mobility for the middle class. And my parents immigrated here 30 years ago to the Bay Area, fleeing a military dictatorship that took over the country that they were coming from. And it was really three things that enabled them to succeed. If you distill down what is the middle class and what enables social mobility, it's the three things you asked me about. It was housing, transportation, and a sense of safety and environment. When my parents came here, we were 3 generations in a single bedroom apartment. And amidst that shelter as well, my mom would be housing other immigrants who moved to the country as well. Like until I was the age of 10, there was a different guy living in our apartment or our house. And effectively our house was the source of transitional shelter for people coming for a better life. Transportation, my mom would take public transit every day when we didn't have a car initially to take us to public schools. And she fought to take us to the best public schools. And often for immigrants, that is the source by which we get access to services that are not otherwise available to us. And then the environment. My parents left a country that had massive amounts of pollution. I didn't recognize this myself, that when the fires were happening last year, amongst very disturbing reactions to the sky and thinking we're in Blade Runner, my first reaction was like, wow, this smells like Pakistan, where my family was from. And then I was like, wait, that means Pakistan smells like smoke. I'd never put the two things together. I just assumed that's what the country smelled like. It's pollution. The AQI index in Pakistan and Lahore, where my parents are from, was almost as bad as what we had in the fires last year. And so my parents left a country that had all those components that was pushing back against their ability to move up. And it was only when they came here that those facets of housing, transportation, and the environment, having stable housing and stable transportation, accessible transportation, and stable environment, enabled them to finally break into the middle class. And I've focused my career over the last decade from science, technology, and policy. I'm an academic neuroscientist by training, worked for President Obama on small business policy, worked in the private sector on nonprofits to help with small businesses get micro lending services for the working poor, as well as private sector technology companies that actually help to democratize access to technology for everyone in small, medium-sized businesses. And I really feel that the challenges that we face, especially as we saw over the last year of the pandemic, the solutions that we need in the next decade are going to require science, technology, and policy merging together to address the challenges we have ahead. As we saw, the pandemic was solved by scientists and technologists and policymakers working together. Climate is the same way. Healthcare is the same way. Housing, to some extent, is the same way. And I'm running because I feel that that set of experience is necessary in the most critical decade that we have ahead. And it's a deeply personal journey for me to make sure we address that, so that if my parents came here today, they could actually make it. Because I firmly believe that is impossible at this point. And so that's why I decided to run, and a little bit by myself as well.
All right, thanks for sharing a bit about your personal journey. For everyone in the audience, I'm going to ask a couple of questions to get us going, and then I'll open it up to all of you. You can use the raise hand function in Zoom, and I'll call on you, or you can also type into the chat and we'll get your questions. But I'll just start with a couple to get things rolling. To begin with, Bilal, would you mind just sharing a couple of your key policy priorities with us that are in these areas?
Yeah, for sure. And so a lot of our policy platform is based on, again, distilling down what are the components that make up the middle class, or what is prohibiting the mobility of the middle class, and how do we actually address those challenges going forward. And so again, what's prohibiting the middle class is lack of access to affordable housing, lack of access to good public transit, and an extent of the impending climate epidemic that's going to come. It's going to be a systemic powder keg in the same way the pandemic was on underlying inequality. Climate's going to have the same effect. So from a housing perspective, and I think all these things are interrelated, especially with small businesses. And I give a good example of this is that, do you know why, I don't know if we had this conversation before, but why do businesses in San Francisco close at 9 o'clock versus in New York, they stay open till like past midnight? Slightly rhetorical question, but it's because of BART. The last line for BART closes at midnight. So because workers don't live in San Francisco because of lack of affordable housing, they have to leave by 9 o'clock so that they're not stopped halfway through their commute on the other side. And I think this shows how all these issues are interconnected. Housing policy relates to transit policy, relates to small business policy, relates to, again, climate policy. Because people don't live next to where they work, we get a rising side in emissions of people who can't take public transit, they'll just start driving cars. So I think for me, that's kind of the core component. If we understand the problem, all these issues are interconnected. From a policy platform and a solutions perspective, we break down the source of concerns. And I think the best way to look at it, where do emissions happen in climate? And then how do we tackle those things individually? So 40% of emissions in climate change happen from cars, 20% from factories, 10% from houses and buildings, and 10% from agriculture. The policies that you enact have to be then proportional and commensurate to those respective emission sources to actually tackle that. So how do we solve the car emissions? We focus a lot on kind of like moving to electric cars, but one of the best ways to actually reduce housing emissions is to have better affordable housing. If you had more housing relative to where people work, they wouldn't need to actually drive cars. So one of the best housing policies is to ensure that you have more affordable housing, ensure upzoning, and prohibiting exclusionary zoning, and then ensuring we can upzone that context. One of the other critical components of our policy platform on housing, though, is that we focused, and we're making a lot of good progress on the ability to build more, but we aren't focusing on the time or the cost it takes to build. SB 9, SB 10 were great starts, but they're going to take years to get the housing that's necessary for people to live. So how do we reduce the cost to build? And that's through mandating requirement median times on counties from the state on the time that median time to build, and then penalties on the context. And that will then force municipalities below them to actually then reform their permitting infrastructure, which is one of the primary drivers for why costs and time to build are so much higher in San Francisco than other cities or counties, because of the number of permits that we have. Go to the next source of emissions, houses and buildings and factories. So one of the things we want to do there, and that's part of our Green New Deal policy, is a zero interest loan for every individual or small business owner to retrofit their house, their building, their factory to be carbon neutral. One of the larger, it's expensive, so this gives them, it's modeled on the original New Deal that FDR did, giving these low interest loans, in this case, zero interest loans for every individual to retrofit their house or building or factory to be carbon neutral. And be funded by a carbon tax to actually fund the difference of the interest rate. But that will then energize a whole new economy to have actual workers to actually build and work on this capacity. So we'll also have a planning commission to ensure just transition of jobs and actually to retrofit those components. And then the third is actually then with transit. So once you have more affordable housing next to the places that people live, we need to ensure that there's better affordable transit between those areas as well. And so as we know, Muni has a structural deficit, which is why the lines have been reduced. So we want to, in the state, ensure we close that structural deficit, but also, again, make it faster to build. One of the prohibited factors that's actually making it harder to build is that we have 27 different Bay Area transit agencies in the Bay Area. They're not interconnected, they're not talking to each other. So we want to create a single kind of like administrative agency on top of it that actually would then help centralize those efficiencies, ensure consistent fares, but also ensure building is done more effectively as well. And it's only if we have those holistic set of solutions from affordable housing, better public transit, and incentives for individuals to retrofit to be carbon neutral that we actually get a full holistic solution. And I do think climate is the best lens to look at all of these things together. And then that drives the policy solutions that we drive as well. So yeah, that's how I would approach our platform in this context.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned SB 9 and 10, which all of us in the YIMBY Action Network very much support. Good to hear you mention those. However, it was a real challenge to get both of those passed.
Sure.
And really to do anything in the legislature is tough despite the Democratic supermajority. Can you tell us how you would actually get things done?
Yeah, so I think if you distill down how did we get SB 9, SB 10 to pass, but also how did we get one of David Chu's recent bills for offshore wind farms to pass? It took multiple years, and it took kind of like three things in coordination to happen, and we'd follow the same model. The first is we need to ensure we capture the press attention and have big, bold policy. Incremental policy just does not capture attention of individuals. And so you need big, bold policy and ideas and frame that framework so that people actually conceptualize it, and that draws people's attention. You'll have simultaneous, like, smaller policies underneath the hood that then you lose as leverage, and then kind of what SB 9, SB 10 became. And so you kind of go the two-pronged strategy. The second is you ensure that you build in community of grassroots movements and coalitions of individuals. And I think I'll give another example of a legislation that didn't pass, which I think how we could pass it. So that's AB 550. That was the automated traffic enforcement. And it didn't pass. And that was a bill I was supporting and trying to help push forward with a couple of friends as well. It didn't pass because we didn't have the right coalitions. We focused too much on just the transportation and the YIMBY element of it. We did not bring in criminal justice reform advocates as well. And so had we brought them in, we would have been able to have a complete package and apply pressure on legislators on the typical types of interests that they listen to. And that would have helped to get it passed. And that'll be one of the first things I do, is make sure we build a broader coalition for AB 550 to resurrect it. Similarly, for the next housing, the next climate bills, we need to build a broader coalition. And so one of the things that we need to do there is better public-private partnerships with climate tech companies. A lot of the solutions that are going to come from climate tech, they don't have traditional relationships with government as much as oil and gas unions do that apply that pressure. So we need to bring in that counterbalancing force of new companies that are actually trying to do good for our environment and working with them. And I have a lot of relationships with those companies as well. And then the third is building a grassroots movement of individuals like YIMBY Action, like Urban Environmentalists, to apply that grassroots movement and pressure on our legislators and working in that movement capacity. I think thankfully for SB 9 and SB 10, because of those, you've actually started a movement. You're shifted the Overton window in housing. So I think now is the time to keep that momentum going so we don't lose it and apply that to other broader policy like climate. And I think that's what I hope to do is I want to be the Scott Wiener for climate. Scott Wiener is the Scott Wiener for climate, but he can only take so many bills at a time. I'm willing to take my political capital and sacrifice it on climate change as their primary issue, because I think it's the existential threat that we face. And I feel those three components in collaboration, again, with a two-pronged strategy for bill proposals, public-private partnerships and grassroots movements, that's how we'll win and continue to advance policy going forward.
All right, thanks for giving us some specific examples there. Now I want to turn it over to all of you in the audience. You can use the raise your hand function and I will attempt to see that and call on you. But in the meantime, I saw that there was a question from Simon. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, sure. So I was asking about AB 629. David Chu introduced the Seamless and Resilient Bay Area Transit Act, kind of in partnership with Seamless Bay Area, the org. And so I was wondering your position on that and what would you do? Because right now I think it's in a holding pattern.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I'm fully in support of that. It relates to the facets of what I think are the problem with transit in the Bay Area is that we need to firstly not think of transit as just within one city. It is an inner city problem. And two, that proposal was, I think, a great proposal to having a better coordinated affairs as well as a transit agency, as well as kind of like ensuring that building happens successfully. One example I'll give of why that type of program is necessary is I was reading into reports about why was it so hard to build the Van Ness rapid bus transit project. Granted, that's not an inter-county project, but it came down to two factors. One was the planning that went into it. They did not collaborate well between the design and the engineer or the contractor. The engineer or the contractor was brought in at the last design phase. That led to mistakes. But the larger problem then became that because workers are so out of practice, it seems innocuous, but it seems consistently, that's what I find in talking to experts here, is that because workers are so out of practice in building construction around transit, they keep making mistakes and then the time to build gets even longer. And so it's a chicken egg problem and a vicious cycle. And I think that these types of proposals that David Chu had been proposing would have helped in a moderate capacity to help ensure having a single agency that kind of like could be on top of it would be super helpful in that context as well. So I think how we promote it, we keep trying again in that context, but also I think bringing in broader coalitions. I do think, again, the Overton window on climate and housing is shifting. People recognize the importance of transit and ensuring that we have a single transit agency kind of above the 27 Bay Area transit agencies that we have. And I would be very in support of 629 as well. And to ensure like fares are consistent.
All right, do you have any other questions? I'm looking for hands raised. Stephen Martin Pinto.
Yeah, I have a question with regards to public safety. I think a lot of people are, they don't feel safe on BART, they don't feel safe on Muni, and that's why they're not taking it nowadays, because they just don't feel safe from lack of security. Also, I'm hearing every day more and more San Franciscans leaving the city, and now they're becoming commuters because they don't feel safe here in the city anymore. And I think that has a lot of implications on climate, as you very are passionately for it. So What is your position on public safety with regards to the transit agent with BART, Muni, with San Francisco? Do you support the hiring of more police, or do you support the defunding of police? Do you support the current DA, Chase Bodine, or do you not support him?
Yeah, and so I'll share a personal story on this capacity is that pivoting the question a little bit, but there has been a debate over the last year about whether we should have free Muni or more Muni. And my perspective on that was that the ultimate goal of society should be accessible services with free Muni. And I know this because when I ran a company in the private sector, we gave free Muni to all our employees, and it increased adoption of the services. People were taking less cars; they were taking Muni to come into work. To your point, Stephen, an interesting facet though was that a significant percentage of the employees did not take Muni, and they didn't take it because a lot of them were being harassed, and a lot of those percentage of people were the female employees at our company. And that issue, this was pre-Chase Bodine, this was, and if you talk to a lot of transit activists, harassment in public transit is a national issue, and it's unfortunately very concerning. And so my general perspective on the free Muni thing is we need to ensure that Muni is more accessible and safe for everyone before we make it free, because a free bridge to nowhere doesn't actually go anywhere. We have lines that are being reduced because of a structural deficit. It's not safe for different reasons. And so we need to ensure that we make Muni and transit better and more efficient, more services before we eventually make it free. And that was my general policy in public on that sense as well. It's the long-term goal. And then the short term, we need to make things sure they're more accountable and safer. On the general question of public safety and accountability, I do agree that a lot of individuals feel unsafe right now. There's been 300 hate crimes over the last year against Asian Americans, and there's been very few charges and very few prosecuted. I've had tons of friends who have moved out of the city due to break-ins, and that is drastically affecting the likelihood of people to stay in the city. And I do think those things need to be addressed, and it's less in the state's control, unfortunately, in some of those facets. But I do think public safety and accountability has been getting worse, and there are clear cases of incompetence in many different parts of our criminal justice system in San Francisco that need to be looked at and addressed.
Thanks, Bilal. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Will.
Thanks, and thanks for speaking with us today, Bilal. I want to ask kind of a question that's framed in the way SB 9 and SB 10 were recently signed, which is that Governor Newsom waited until the day after the recall election to sign those two bills. And
Sure.
As someone who wants to think that more housing and upzoning is popular, that it's kind of disappointing to see the governor had to wait until he was no longer on the chopping block in front of voters to sign good legislation.
I think
the ball.
More disappointing thing has been the things that he's decided to veto, since you would have thought that not having a recall, not being recalled would give him a mandate to do the things we like. But yeah, that was even more disappointing. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. So my question is, beyond kind of the interest group type stuff you mentioned of building a broader coalition in terms of the special interests that exist, which is of course an important part of legislating, how do we actually change hearts and minds in the state so that the kinds of things you're talking about that are music to the ears of, I would guess, most of the people on this call, are things that resonate more broadly, so that the governor is touting SB 9 and SB 10 as things he got done before voters choose whether to vote for him rather than after?
Yeah, so I think very hard question. I think the thing I would approach it by is I look to Scott as a model for how did he get from 0 to 1? We're now going from stage of 1 to 2. And I think it starts with the individuals that you elect. I do think change can happen from one person. And I think Scott was that person to ensure. I mean, he was advocating for housing over years when it was not popular. There was not a grassroots movement. There was not even public discourse about the importance of housing as a central component for affordability, upward mobility, and climate. So I think we had someone with political courage that had that conversation and pushed it forward. And Scott single-handedly, in my opinion, in conjunction with David Chu, helped to push the Overton window on that. So I think the first thing you do is you get more people elected like Scott. The more people you have political courage who don't make decisions based on just popular opinion, they make decisions based on research and facts and conviction. That's how you start that movement. Second, then, is you help. I think the special interest component of it, bringing in more public-private partnerships to help transition and integrate them into the state legislature, that then helps apply pressure on other individuals in the Democratic Party. And then third, once there's a groundswell of that, that will then hopefully pressure up to Newsom. Unfortunately, money controls a lot of politics. And so the more we get people who either have taken corporate pledges from a cultural shift, like I've taken a corporate pledge not to take any corporate PAC donations, any law enforcement, or any oil and gas money. The California Democratic Party still has not even, they just went through that process and they didn't commit to that. And so the more politicians we can get to commit to that over time, which we're transitioning to, that ensures more money stays up, more corporate money does not get into politics, and that will ensure the lack of that process as well. But maybe not necessarily a satisfactory answer, but I do firmly believe that the more Scots we get into the state legislature, the more of the groundswell that we build to then apply pressure on the other state legislatures, which then applies pressure on Newsom as
well. All right. We are definitely here for grassroots activity. But we, in the meantime, have another question from Joe. Would you like to unmute yourself, or I can read your question for you if you cannot unmute?
Sure. I guess the state government, if is poised to take over the SF school district due to a couple quid missing in the budget.
And because they don't know how to manage a budget, but yes.
Yeah. I guess as an assemblyman, how would you reform the district to be solvent, and how would you attract families back into the public school system? And if you want to comment on the other controversy of the school district, I suppose.
Sure. Yeah, so I think this is also an issue that's deeply personal for me because while I don't have kids, so many of my friends have left the city as soon as they did. And it's predominantly two reasons: affordable housing and space, as well as then the lack of good public schools. I'm a product of the public school system. My mom was a librarian. My grandmother was a teacher for special ed as well. So public education, public schools runs literally in my blood, and I know how it can work very well. And seeing what's happening at SFUSD is like, I think, an exact testament of incompetence, malfeasance, and just really lowering the bar on education and acceleration when we should be lowering the bar when we should be accelerating and raising the bar. And so what can the state do to ensure that the reasons why do people leave is because the quality of education is poor, we're not paying teachers enough, we're not getting the best talent, and we're not able to keep our teachers here. So here's the ways that we actually ensure that we solve those problems. One, we make sure we have a world-class education. In San Francisco, it's one of the few major US cities that actually has lowered the bar in education. They don't teach 8th grade algebra anymore. When I went to public school, we were taking 7th and 8th grade algebra. And we need to ensure that we are raising the bar for our students so they're prepared for the workforce. So in the state, we can mandate that there has to be the option for algebra to be taught in middle schools again and have accelerated math. Two, it goes back to affordable housing. Why don't a lot of teachers work in SFUSDs? Because they can't afford to live here. So if you make better affordable housing, you can then ensure that the teachers can actually live here. We've had some proposed affordable housing projects for those teachers. They're still not built yet. It's been taking forever. And so we need to have, and that goes back to the time and the cost to build reforms that we need to do as well. So you have better affordable housing, the teachers can stay here as well. The teacher pay in San Francisco is actually very low, despite the budget being very large. So we need to reappropriate that and ensure that we're increasing teacher pay. And lastly, we need to do some measure of tax reform to ensure that, and everyone I think here probably knows this, but due to outdated and antiquated tax policies in California, a lot of our schools are underfunded on a per student basis. And so we need to reform that as well. And then the third is that, why did so many people leave San Francisco last year from schools? It's because the schools were closed. We were the only major school district in a major US city that remained closed to in-person learning the entire year when it was perfectly safe to do so. And we saw that simultaneously happen with private schools that remained open. And so to ensure that we can remain open, A, we need to recall the school board, but B, we need to actually have funding for rapid COVID testing, filtration systems to be available in all schools and funded. LA County is doing this through a massive amount of budget. We're not doing that in San Francisco County just yet. And so having state funding for every school district to have rapid COVID testing, air filtration systems to ensure that when the next epidemic happens, which will happen, they can remain open and safe at the same time. And that's how we ensure that parents stay here, as those are the three components what needs to be solved to ensure a school system is stable, but also advances to the next stage.
Thanks. As a soon-to-be new parent myself, I am just like, oh, how is this gonna work?
Are you dreading the lottery system?
I mean, I'm glad that I have a few years until I have to deal with it.
Maybe we'll reform that by the time you get there as well. So
yeah. Okay, so now pivoting to one of our favorite topics at Urban Environmentalists, parking. Zach, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, so I guess excessive parking subsidies and requirements to build parking, and parking being bundled into housing, goods, and services is kind of a key detriment to both housing affordability and meeting our climate goals.
Yeah.
But it is also, of course, a challenging topic politically. So what reforms would you support at the state level?
Yeah, I mean, I generally believe cities should be built for people, not cars. I think Joanne and I have joked about this, that it'd be nicer if San Francisco was more like Berlin than San Francisco. But I do think cities need to be redesigned to take into account what does a modern urban city mean, and a modern cosmopolitan city. And to me, that's one that has density, has individuals, has workers and people who work in restaurants, as well as people who work in other businesses. Everyone can live together and have access to the same services. And I do think that so many parking lots in San Francisco, I live in Soma, they're all empty. And I think especially with a lot of Soma was kind of like tech companies. They're going remote. We're going to get less people commuting and actually staying in these parking lots. So I do think there needs to be an incentive structure shift that those subsidies for parking should probably be removed and ensure that we actually build more housing to take its place, because they're just sitting there empty. On the flip side, I think if you distill down why is it so hard to win this argument, it's because I do think we're not incorporating dialogue, at least with affected communities that feel disenfranchised. So I think one of the things that we need to consider from a holistic approach perspective is that I do think one thing that could help is ensuring that as we remove parking lots, we ensure that there's more public transit. Because there's this perception, especially from my community and people of color, that as you remove cars, then it feels to them like they can't commute to the locations they need because the public transit doesn't go. As we've known, there's a structural deficit in Muni and the lines aren't going there. So I think it's a communication problem that we need to convey and have holistic solutions that maybe it's one-to-one. You remove a parking lot, guarantee 50 more buses or something. And I think that can help to win the argument and ensure that we have holistic approaches to transportation and housing solutions. I think that's how we should approach it, is ensure that maybe a one-to-one, if you remove a parking lot, city guarantees we'll get more bus lines. And I think that's what we need to ensure to get these solutions in place and get less pushback going forward.
Sticking with the topic of our roads, Vanessa, would you like to ask your question?
Right. So you mentioned automatic speed enforcement earlier. I was wondering if you had any other policies in mind to make our roads safer for everyone.
Yeah, so in the state, there's a couple of things. One of the weird idiosyncrasies of how speed limits are set is it's set at the 85th percentile of what people are driving at rather than what they should be driving at. So it ends up being this weird chicken egg problem of like, if people just tend to be driving at some higher speeds, the speed limit just gets set at the 85th percentile of it. I think there was a bill that passed. Does anyone know if Newsom signed it yet? He signed it? That's great. So I think we can further extend that. I think it was an early start to it. We can continue to reform those rules around the 85th percentile legislation. So that's one thing, is enforcing speed limits at a better capacity. Second is automated speed enforcement. Other facets of transportation, I think that's kind of like where I think the state has the best influence on those things. I think in the city, there's a lot of other things we can do, from speed bumps to ensuring that we make other parts of the city more car-free. Some more incentives for that, and more parks, I think, would be helpful as well, that are focused on people. But I think my legislation would be focused on continuing to enforce speed enforcement laws and to ensure that that's done from the state's control perspective to incentivize that.
All right, Simon, would you like to ask your second question?
Sure. This is just a general question about your competition and how you would say you're different than your competition.
Yeah, I mean, a couple fold. One is I would personally say I'm the only YIMBY actually in the race. If you look at the records of our competition, they haven't historically voted or endorsed YIMBY candidates. And so I generally say the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And from a policy and research perspective, we are consistent. Second is from an experience perspective. The challenges that we face and have been facing over the last couple of years, pandemics, healthcare, climate change, they are science, technology, and policy problems. And I have the unique experience that blends all of those three things together, having been an academic neuroscientist and then a technologist, as well as having worked in the nonprofit sector and worked for President Obama on national policy related to small businesses and 4G infrastructure. It requires an intersection of those three components to actually solve the challenges that we have ahead. And other facets, I think, of that are necessary to actually address these challenges. And I think just the fact that I'm a political outsider, I think that's a strength, not a weakness. What does it take to require the political courage to act on your principles? It's when you're not beholden to corporate interests, like we're not. It's when you have the political courage to act on your convictions in a very critical decade that we have ahead. If we don't have politicians like Scott Wiener is amazing because he operates based on principle and conviction of policy rather than popular opinion. If we operate on popular opinion, we would not have SB 9 or SB 10 or SB 35, especially we wouldn't have SB 35. And so it requires people who operate on conviction, not on popular opinion. And I think that is fundamentally also what differentiates me. I'm the only candidate in the race that has actually a rigorous platform page already, because most candidates hide it because they want to do some kind of opinion poll to figure out what they want to kind of position out there. We spent 6 months of research just prepping for this from a general capacity to know from a first principles perspective what's actually going to solve the problems. It doesn't matter if it's on one side of the political aisle or another. It's what we feel is right to actually solve the problems and what's actually worked in different cities and counties before. And so I think that's what differentiates us, is our experience, our conviction to solve challenges, and our commitment to these values of being a YIMBY and pro-housing and pro-climate change reduction, is that's what differentiates us.
Thanks, Bilal. Speaking of YIMBY concept, maybe Zach, would you like to ask your second question?
Yeah, it seems like there's kind of a growing buzz around the concept of social housing, and there's I'm seeing kind of all these great like images pop up of the 18-story mass timber with greenery mixed in, and there's obvious kind of environmental benefits. But what do you think? What do you think is the realistic role for that relative to market rate or just market developed housing?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think we're in a housing crisis, and we're going to have a climate crisis, and we need to deploy all the solutions as possible, whatever is quickest, fastest, medium term, long term. I do like the concept of mixed income social housing as well. Sonia Trauss had a really good article that she released a couple weeks back, I think. That's how a lot of social housing is done in Europe as well. It's not just low income social housing, it's mixed income social housing. And I think that's beneficial for the community. It actually ensures we have less gentrification and actually ensures that we can get more affordable housing. It's also because the affordable housing rates that we set are based on arbitrary AMI indexes, which I'm not sure how many people how they define that was the appropriate threshold to be qualified as affordable housing. And I think a lot of the challenge of people in San Francisco today, and what the theme of our campaign is that San Francisco should represent a beacon of hope for everyone, and especially the middle class and the lower middle class and people seeking to make it into the middle class. And that's a lot of people. And even people, low-income workers are definitely very affected, but a lot of people in the middle also don't feel that they can afford to live here. They don't qualify for low-income housing, but they also they can't afford the most expensive condos either. And so in that context, I do think concepts of social housing on a mixed income basis can be potential solutions as well. In addition to, we do need more market rate housing. And I think one of the reasons that's important too is that I firmly believe that climate change is going to drastically restructure internal migration within our own country. We're going to start to have climate refugees coming to San Francisco. And those climate refugees, quote unquote, will actually be a bunch of very rich people because they'll be the ones who are able to afford it. And so that's why we do need to still consider kind of like larger market rate housing so that they don't take the housing away from lower income folks who already live here as well, especially people of color. So we need to build all types of housing to welcome all types of people that are going to be coming here to ensure that we don't get increased gentrification, we don't price people out, we don't push people out of the city as well, especially because climate's going to cause systemic powder keg moments on the issues that we have ahead.
All right, I'm going to ask one of my own questions. I'm curious, as a former state agency employee, the legislature passes a lot of laws, but they frequently go to state agencies to get implemented. And HCD has to decide, is this housing element compliant or not? The Air Resources Board has to decide what to put into its carbon roadmap. What do you see as the role of the legislature in getting the machinery of government to go do things?
Yeah, I think I probably approach it in the same way that I approach management in an executive context, having run companies before, which is the role of executive leadership is to provide the outcomes that we measure success by and not micromanage the details. It's the role of the agencies to figure out the how. The executives or the leadership, or in this case, the legislature, defines the what. That tends to lead to the best outcomes and it's most scalable, at least not micromanaging, but it also leads to effective components. But then the critical component then is we need to ensure we're setting very clear outcomes and guardrails in the legislation to ensure it's being steered in the right direction. I think SB 35 is a great example of where it set outcomes as part of the legislation that ensured, I mean, granted now Marin and people are suing it, but we'll get past that eventually, but at least it was a very outcomes driven legislation and a good framework for how to operate within. And I think we need more bills like that, where the guardrails and the frameworks and the outcomes are built into the legislation to ensure that they provide the guidance necessary for the state agencies to operate, but also restricts and operates to actually define for the agency how they need to be measured success by. I think if we had more measures of success and call in the corporate context OKRs or KPIs built into the legislation, I think we'd have better guidance to the state agencies to ensure they stay within those metrics as well.
All right, thanks. Maurice, I see you've got your hand raised.
Hi, Bilal.
Hello.
My name is Maurice Rivers. I am a native of San Francisco. I was quite pleasantly surprised to see that you were running for state assembly.
Thank you.
I love that you're a man of color. And I do have some concerns, though, because David Campos and Matt Haney, they have some serious one-ups on you. They have name recognition. One is a former supervisor, one is a current supervisor, and they've got a lot of political leverage.
Yeah.
So what is it going to take to elevate you and get you the voting base that you need to get these people out of office that just use political office as a merry-go-round? What is it going to take to get you above all of that and get them out of there?
Yeah.
So how are you going to address those big things?
Yeah, I appreciate the question and definitely recognize those concerns as well, and appreciate the comment as well. So I think one thing to take in mind is we've done polling, and also I talked to 200 people this weekend. 5 people maybe knew who Matt Haney or David Campos were. I'm not joking. Like, so few people know who they are. I think when we're in this political bubble, we take for granted the name ID they have and that context. Of like 200 people I talked to this weekend, going door to door or farmers markets, everyone was upset about the outcomes of the city. They couldn't name their supervisor, but they could name the problems that they felt they were facing. Predominantly cost of rent, how to help the unhoused, and public safety. And those components is very shared sentiment of what people are upset by. So I think one is, I think we overestimate the name ID that these individuals have. In polling even earlier that we did, half of primary voters had no idea who they were. And that mirrored very closely to the grassroots interactions that I've had even just this weekend. Second is, from a fundraising perspective, one way that we boost name ID is like, it's digital communication, digital, physical mail. And we have a grassroots movement building around our campaign. In the first week of our campaign, we raised $200,000. And that's a large percentage of that is from people I've never met before. And I think that's a testament to people looking for something different. And all that money and capital actually translates directly into voter outreach we can do, especially in a district this wide, to actually then communicate to every individual effectively. Third is that this is a very interesting race. Joanna was mentioning in the beginning, it's a special election. It's a special election. It's a top 2 primary, usually has lower turnout. So we don't actually have to, and this goes for all the candidates, but like the amount of votes that you need to succeed in this type of election is a lot lower than a normal election. And so with the coalitions that we can build within the YIMBY community, different Democratic clubs, it wouldn't be possible in another election, but it's actually our time to rise above tribal politics. And if we see the things happening with like school board recalls, the groundswell of new individuals who don't traditionally vote, they don't subscribe to understanding who Haney or Campos are, they don't understand progressive versus moderate, They don't understand political coalitions, but they understand the issues that they're worried about. And I think those are the three components of what's possible right now. We're in the right time, the right place, and the right candidate to advocate for change. And that's why I'm optimistic we're going to win. We have the team, we have the resources, we have the talent, and we have a community. And this is one of our biggest chances to actually win in this context that wouldn't be possible in another year. And that's why I'm confident that we'll be able to get past this name ID battle and actually win the election. Does that help, Maurice?
Yes.
All right, do we have any other questions? I can always ask more questions, but raise your hand.
I do also one thing that Maurice is an important context here as well is like a lot of people I've talking to, you noted how like people are padding their resumes and not doing anything for the average San Franciscan. I think the average San Franciscan recognizes that. People have been woken up to that the school board is a stepping stone to supervisor, which is a stepping stone to assembly. They're tired of politicians who are working on the job that they want next rather than the job they have today. More and more people recognize that. And they want to ensure that we hold our politicians accountable so that they focus on their job today and actually get the outcomes that we want in our city. I'm not a career politician. I don't need this job, but I'm doing it because I think it's the most important thing that's necessary for our city. And I'm not going to play the game of like running for school board. I'm not an educator. I'm not going to run for school board just so I can be supervisor, just so I can run for state assembly. I'm not an educator. I went through the public school system, but I think that should go to people who actually have children or have been teachers or been in the public education system. And so I'm largely protesting that you don't have to play the step ladder game. You should run for the position that you're qualified for and that you have a legitimate set of ideas and vision and solutions you want to run for. And that's why we're running. And I think a lot of San Franciscans recognize that now and are looking for something different.
All right, Will, maybe last question.
Sure, thanks. So for the friend or loved one of ours who probably voted in the presidential election, but doesn't have any idea who their supervisor is or assembly representatives are or used to be, what is the 30-second version of why they should vote in the upcoming special election and why they should vote for you that you would want us to share with them?
Yeah, basically we're running on a theme that San Francisco should represent a beacon of hope for the middle class. The two biggest threats to that are inequality and climate change, and the political leadership that we've had in place hasn't gotten the outcomes that we need for the last 10 years, and we need someone who represents them. I'm a child of immigrants. I would be the third renter to actually serve in the state. I'd be the first South Asian, the second South Asian, the first Muslim American, first Pakistani American, first millennial from San Francisco. I mean, come on. If you don't have representation in the city, that's not what's going to actually, we're not going to get the outcomes we need. And we need people who have informed context about the challenges that we have ahead. Inequality and climate are largely a function of science, technology, and policy problems. And I've worked for President Obama, I've run private companies, I've worked in the nonprofit sector. It's going to require that type of experience to address the critical challenges we have ahead. And this election is really important. Whatever San Francisco does, California does, whatever California does, the country does, whatever the country does, the world does. We have 5 to 8 years left with climate change. Whatever we do in the next 1 to 2 years is going to set the next precedent for the rest of the administration. Fingers crossed Biden stays. And so we have very critical time to affect that change. And so this election will be the stepping stone, or effectively it's going to set the precedent for the policies that the rest of the country is going to enact. So that's why they should pay attention to the special election, is because from everything from housing to schools to climate, whatever gets set in the next 2 years is going to set the precedent for the rest of the country. And that's why they need to vote in the special election and why we think we're the most qualified.
All right, thanks. I'm going to squeeze in one last question myself because I can. You mentioned representation, and I just noticed on this call that it looks like almost all of us on this call are men and not women. One does not know, and not everyone has their pronouns listed, but I I just was wondering if you could speak a little bit to women's representation and women's issues.
Yeah, totally. It's very important to me. 100% of my staff are women. 25% of my staff are LGBTQ2 plus. And so I've set that foundation from the very beginning, because I think unless you have representation in leadership, you're not going to get the right policies. If you don't surround yourself with people who have lived experiences and are affected individuals, you can't have the right policies in place. You'll just be tone deaf. And in that context, from a women's rights perspective, we have a platform. I think we're the only candidate who has a listed platform in this context as well. But I break it down in threefold. For us, it's all of our platform has these three components of what can we do that's like really radically, one small change that has a radical impact difference. What's one things we can do immediately, and what's what we can do in long-term reform. And one of the immediate things we'll do is like single point change is there are thousands of rape test kits that are still backlogged pre-2016. One of the first things we'll do is set a bill that mandates that they be processed by January 31st, 2023. And immediately then that gives hopefully justice to so many women that were affected. Second, from an immediate reform perspective, what is the things that are holding back women in the workplace? It's often harassment and prohibitory practices in the private sector. For instance, NDAs can still protect the employer against harassment. So we eliminate NDAs in California from being able to protect employers from harassment claims, and that would be eliminated. Third, then, would be childcare. We're seeing that apparently Manchin just gutted childcare from I just learned this 2 hours ago. It's like climate's out of that, childcare is out of it. It's like, I don't know what's going in the bill anymore. But in California, what we would do is currently women and families have to pay 10% of the family fees. We would reduce that to 1% to make childcare more affordable, especially for lower income workers and folks who can't afford it. But also from LGBTQ plus rights perspective, ensure that childcare and these services and healthcare services are available to chosen families, regardless of their gender or their families that they have chosen to make their own, and ensure those rights as well. So a lot of these policies are based on research that we've done, based on existing bills, as well as like what are the issues that matter to the communities that are affected, and really diving into the details of what the state can be responsible for affecting. And those are some of the first three things we would do once we're in office.
Thank you. All right, we are about at time, though I know we started a couple minutes late. So I want to just give you maybe one more minute, Bilal, to say any closing remarks, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, honored to speak here. Thanks, Joanna, for hosting and facilitating, and thanks everyone here for the questions. Yeah, I think, again, we're running a really exciting campaign. It's a once in a decade shot at the last decade that we have left for the precedent that we're going to set for the rest of the state and the country. The issue of climate is paramount to me, and I think to a lot of people in our generation, because we're the ones who are going to have to live with it for the century to come. And I do think at the center of this is housing, schools, and transit policy. That's what is affecting people's ability and willingness to live in the city. And I feel that we have a unique opportunity to really turn San Francisco again to be a beacon of hope for the middle class, to be a cosmopolitan city that's one that's centered on people and not cars, one that ensures that everyone can have affordable housing to live where they work, and also have a cosmopolitan city where everyone of all different people of color, people of all different races can live here. And that's what I think, that's what we're fighting for, and feel we have a really strong shot to ensure that we elect politicians. Feel weird to still call myself a politician. I was a civil servant a long time ago, but elect politicians who will actually operate on conviction and courage, and not just what gets them, what they think is going to be necessary to get them elected, so that we can actually govern with integrity and ethics going forward. But appreciate everyone's time, and feel free to reach out afterward. Happy to talk one-on-one to anyone as well. So.
Thanks so much, Bill, for joining us. And thank you everyone for coming. We encourage you to come to more of these as we have them. And of course, coming up on November 5th is the YIMBY Action Annual Gala event in San Francisco. So hope to see you there. And on November 6th, we have an urban hike which we're doing in partnership with Walk SF and Northern Neighbors around Coit Tower, and also writing postcards to our elected officials to support car-free spaces. So hope to see you there as well. Take care, everyone.